Hi, as you're probably aware, I've made multiple videos speculating about the next weapon. We know for sure that it's going to be a focus weapon, it's going to be focused on healing, buffing, and supporting, a support class even is what they said. So originally my speculation went towards the Celestial Gauntlet and later towards the Mace. Now we have new information that makes me think it is neither of these options for a very good reason. So the original reason why I thought it was the Celestial Gauntlet was because that was a weapon that was already in the game that was then reworked into the life staff, but in my last video about this I said I don't think it's actually going to be that, just based on the fact that we already have a Void Gauntlet and an Ice Gauntlet and they want their weapons to have unique identities, so there's not much benefit in bringing that back. And there are some other weapons that are currently being worked on. So in the game files, the weapons that we had so far were the Celestial Gauntlet, obviously because it existed beforehand, but also Daggers and the Mace. Now, Daggers have been in the game since forever. They have been tested, they have been listed on perks on a New World database because they're actually in the files and everything. But the devs have specifically said that the next weapon is going to be a support weapon and not Daggers, and that we can expect Daggers at a later point. So yeah, it's not going to be Daggers. So my thought was, okay, based on this, it's very likely going to be the Mace, which would make sense, and I explained why I think this would fit in overall in terms of playstyle and how that weapon could be a support weapon as well. And Mixologic pointed something out on the New World database Discord that made me change my opinion. So what they wrote was, the February PTR leaked the weapon in form of a blank file in the status effect data and spell data. We don't know for sure that it's the next weapon, but at least they have one weapon named Flail they are working on, and since they've mentioned a focus weapon, that kinda aligns. The files in question are from Zelenist Datamining, and they're empty, so there's nothing else in there. But the important thing is that these changes were made in February. The other weapons, the other options that we had so far are much older and, well, could have been by entirely different development teams as well. Them starting to implement it in February would also make sense with the rough timescale of when the expansion will come out. I think that's a good amount of time to work on a weapon for. And look at it this way, if the next weapon for example was a Mace, which is honestly fairly similar to a Flail in terms of concept, they're both strike weapons, they're both probably one-handed, so they have a lot of similarities in the first place, then the weapon after that would probably be Daggers, and then the weapon after that could be the Flail, I suppose. But it would be a very weird timeline for them to already work on the Flail right now on one hand, and also to release such similar weapons so close to each other. Looking at it differently, I think that in many ways the Flail is just a cooler version of having a Mace that is a little more interesting in terms of what you can do with the design and with the attacks and animations. So my assumption is that maybe they started with the foundation of the Mace at some point and then decided, you know what, we can make this better, we can make this more fun, let's turn this into a Flail. Mixologic also pointed out something else that was interesting, being that the Flail has always been sort of rooted in Dungeons & Dragons as a priest weapon, and the priest in New World equals focus. It probably will do something like scale with strength and focus, why not? If that is the case, that would open up a very interesting angle, and that is that of the Paladin. Because I know that a lot of people have been asking for a Paladin class in New World of some degree, and so far it hasn't really been a thing. Yeah, you can pair a shield and a life staff, but it doesn't really feel that effective. And if the Paladin playstyle was more utility focused, I think a lot of people would enjoy that. A lot of games have Paladins, they're usually a very accessible class, so it could be a very good option to implement that at least to some degree through a weapon. And looking at other games even outside of Dungeons & Dragons, this is not uncommon. For example, in World of Warcraft there is a unique Flail weapon, and in Diablo 3, the Crusader, the Paladin's equivalent, also had a Flail. And there's something else that these depictions and interpretations have in common, and that is that they're all holding shields. I know that a lot of players have requested more options to use with the shield. For example, a lot of players would like to use the hatchet along with the shield. I don't think that will ever be the case. I think the weapons that are already designed to be used in a particular way will probably not get a shield addition. But building a new weapon from the ground up with the shield in mind is a very different story. We know that they're planning to make significant changes to blocking in the next patch, and this may very well be in context of this new weapon as well. They say, okay, we need to buff blocking a little bit more, make it a little bit more effective in some situations so that the new weapon can effectively work well with blocking too and be more fun that way. This would make a lot of sense because obviously the expansion will bring back a lot of players, and if they see the new weapon, they're probably going to try the new weapon, and if they feel like they just end up standing there holding right click most of the time, as it is the case for a lot of tanks at the moment with Sword and Shield, then they may not be particularly entertained. So if blocking is better or more interactive, for example through perfect parries, then using that in combination with a new weapon would also be more fun. Of course, we have absolutely no guarantees here. They may have just been testing the Flail briefly or wanted to have it as a possible option for the next weapon and then decided to go with something completely different or go back on something, and that may end up being something else entirely. But I think it's a very cool perspective. I think it would be extremely fun if they actually pulled through with that. If it ends up being a Paladin weapon, that would also allow it to set itself apart a lot more from the current focus weapons, because it would just give you an entirely different identity if you use this weapon compared to, for example, a Void Blade or a Void Gauntlet in general. Of course, you could also be combining the two for a combination of buffing and debuffing. If they go with a shield option, that would also lead to a very interesting shift, because something that you have to keep in mind with armor in general in New World is that going heavy on armor significantly decreases your healing. So a Paladin that's actually going with a heavy armor tower shield would have a much harder time keeping himself alive because his healing would be much lower compared to a light user. And I think that would in a way also be a bit of balance. So maybe you could go into a full healing build and just use a round shield, which is already more of a risk because you can't have a medium chest piece anymore at that point. So you're lowering your armor in some situations anyways. And then you have your life staff and you have your mace that is just focused very much on healing and buffing. And then on the other hand, you could maybe have another option that goes more heavy with a tower shield, lower healing but more survivability through blocks and maybe other additional effects that come in. So you would use that life staff still to give you some extra healing, but it wouldn't be your main tool for surviving. Damage-wise, if it ends up being the Flail, much like with the Mace, I would expect the primary damage to likely be Strike, unless it's specifically focused to be one type of elemental damage. If it's a shield, then obviously you wouldn't be able to have a spellbook in the offhand, like I said with the Mace originally, so you couldn't have mixed types of damage through that. So maybe the Flail could just be a pure type of elemental damage, nature, arcane, or lightning, or it could just be Strike. Once there's more information, I will of course update you, so consider subscribing and clicking the bell if you want to be notified. I also want to throw you a bit of wild speculation here. If the next weapon ends up being the Flail, or the Mace, really either of them, then I'm gonna predict that the next weapon afterwards is going to be Daggers, because we know that they have been working on that for a while, so it seems very likely that it's coming eventually, and they know the demand for that. And then after that, I think there's a good chance that the next weapon will be the pistol, or pistols maybe as dual wield. There might be an elemental ranged weapon like a lightning staff or something in between there as well, but I think the pistols will be kind of lined up after the daggers at some point, because we know that they have been working on them as well, unless they're scrapped. And I also know that a lot of people want to have pistols, and pistols would be really cool weapons that also kind of bridge the gap between being super long range and being super close range. But I have no evidence of that or anything. I just want to do this as a wild prediction and then see years later down the line when the weapons are actually released if this is actually what we got or we got something completely different. Before I go, a quick FYI, I'm thinking about streaming on Twitch a little bit again. If you'd like to see that, twitch.tv/GeekSloth, you can follow me there and you'll see if I actually end up doing it, if I'm actually online. Other than that, thanks to my patrons for supporting this video, and thank you for watching. GeekSloth, out.